Yes. So, good evening, everyone, and warm welcome to our esteemed speaker today. I wholeheartedly welcome all the panelists and attendees to this lecture of the International Igniting Mind lecture series organized by Jagran Lakecity University School of Law. It is an honor for me to welcome Dr. Steve Wood in this lecture series. Today, we are going to discuss on a topic of global importance, that is the WTO dispute system in the world of Trump. We are fortunate to have Dr. Steve Wood, who is one of the few major contributors in the world in this area of study. I hope that today your talk on the topic of the WTO dispute system will encourage our attendees to think towards this area of concern and in this already complex and challenging times. Before I hand over the session to Dr. Steve Wood, I would like to tell you a few things from his extremely vast background. So Dr. Steve Wood is a principal lecturer who has been lecturing at Leeds Beckett for 20 years. His specialist research interest is terrorism studies, particularly in aviation sector. Steve previously owned his own business offering employment law services to employees and employers. In 2000, he decided to change direction and go into teaching, which he has been doing ever since. He has been and still is an examiner at a number of universities. Steve has carried out a number of roles at Leeds Beckett. He was program director for the LLB program for 5 years and for 2 years, subject leader of the commercial law group. He specializes in the law and policy relating to terrorism, which he currently teaches to undergraduate students as well as international trade law. Steve is interested in transitional education and he has recruited and taught students around the world, including Brazil, Colombia, India, China, Vietnam, and the Philippines. He is currently in charge of international development and enterprise and developing partnership in Mauritius and Botswana. He has supervised the development of a distance learning corners course. He is interested in supervising students who are interested in terrorism studies. Especially, he is currently teaching on counterterrorism, UK anti-terrorism law and policy, public law, and employment law. He is interested in his area of research interests are terrorism in the aviation sector and its impact on the experience of passengers. He has spoken about the subject conferences in the press and on television nationally and internationally. So now I request Dr. Steve Wood to kindly address the attendees.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this series of lectures, and warm welcome from the UK. And I can tell you that we do have sun in the UK today, and we meet each other in very extraordinary circumstances. Circumstances are that we seem to have gone from a system of being taught face-to-face to a system of being taught now and lectures online. And I'd just like to say before I do start is that I have visited the campus a number of years ago, around 6 years ago, and I had a fantastic time there, and I do miss it. I wish I was delivering this session in your law school, in which at the time when I was there, it was just being built. So, I would like to come back one day and visit the campus. So my lecture today, which is really generally a discussion more than anything, is the dispute resolution process of the WTO. Now, I'm making a presumption that all students won't know about the WTO, so I'm going to do some very simple overviews first to make sure that everybody's on board and everybody can understand, as you might say. So the WTO, an international body with 164 members, it deals with the 98% of world trade. It's the dispute body, or the fundamental way in which people have been dealing with international trade since the evolution of GATT in 1945. So it deals with ways to resolve disagreements in the interpretation and the application of WTO rules. So the main rules are contained in 3 areas, which is the GATT, which are goods, GATS, which are services, and intellectual property. So it tries to deal with things with its members through mainly consultation. If not, then it goes through a process of establishing a panel and maybe an appeal. And there is an opportunity for arbitration, but arbitration is very, very seldomly processed. It's only ever happened once. So it's there to resolve disputes, so trade disputes. So before the dispute settlement process, it isn't individuals, it is countries. And the purpose is there to clarify the rights and obligations under the treaty, and the interpretation of the treaties is via the Vienna Convention, which gives the language and meaning of GATS, its ordinary meaning and language. So there is a process first in how we deal with dispute settlement under the WTO. So rather than launch into proceedings, the main purpose is to perhaps not resort to formal process. So the idea is to have consultation first. It's a prerequisite that parties are obliged to try to resolve matters before a panel is formed. And that is a panel that is established to consider the complaint and to make a report. And the report is either accepted or rejected. If the other side disagrees, then they can appeal, and that goes to the appellate body to look at. Now, just here, I want to just outline the process for you. You could go to the WTO website and see this process. So this is the process. It's a little bit like, if you can imagine going to a court, you start with the lower courts and you end up going higher and higher, and then you need some process of a remedy. And then within all of this process, on one side, of your left-hand side, you can see there are strict time limits to each process. The WTO there tries to make sure that cases don't stagnate. And the reason for this is because in previous formations of WTO, in trade itself, international trade, which was established under GATT, the process of deciding or resolving issues were very stagnated because it required a consensus under GATT. So from 1945 to 1994, which was the GATT years, and mainly under goods, in order to determine a case, there had to be a consensus, which you can understand. It's a way of stagnating. That doesn't actually occur under the new system since 95. And so this is the process of dealing with members, as you might say. So just to clear and simplify things, the stages are consultation, establishment of a panel, and when we mean by panel, we mean a series of individuals, experts from different countries. So you might have a panel of 3 members, such as Thailand, India, and Japan could be a panel, and they will sit and decide on an issue which has got nothing to do with them. So it might be a dispute between the EU and the United States, the US. So they could be sitting on and reviewing a particular case. And it's interesting when you look at the cases in the WTO, of which there are now more than 500 resolved disputes, is that what you actually do find is that the majority of those cases are with the bigger parties. So you often find it's the big parties that try and bend the rules. So you'll probably find that it's particularly the US and the EU that have been before the panel and before the process more than any other country. Now that might be because they've been part of the membership from its very start, but nevertheless, it just goes to show that big countries or large countries are very keen to try and protect their own trade. So the establishment of a panel, examination and review by the panel of the issue. Then the panel reports to the parties in the dispute. And then the panel report goes to the dispute settlement body, so the DSB. So the DSB at that point normally adopts a report, or there could be a process in which by one of the parties decides to appeal. And that often is the case, particularly for large countries, will often appeal if they're aggravated simply to delay the case. It's often a tactic. And at that point, then there'll be more legal individuals involved. So just imagine, as you can imagine, the developing countries and the size of their international trade department in their government, and then imagine someone like the US, how many people are employed to work as a part of the WTO in the US. So what you can see sometimes is that you'll see a disproportionate advantage to the larger parties because they employ more lawyers, more advisors, and they deal with things more tactically rather than, because law and deciding cases is often about tactics, not just the law itself. And then the implementation of the decision by the losing parties, compensation, retaliation, and possible arbitration. So, like normal courts, you're awarded damages, and in some cases, in many cases under the DSU, you are awarded compensation, but you're not given a lump sum of money. It's often there'll be a change in the tariff between the trading partners that will allow for the compensation to be paid over a particular period of time. So the panel's final report, assessment of the possible breaches of WTO rules, and makes recommendations to the breaching party, not legally binding until adopted by the DSB, and can be appealed by both sides. So when we say breaching of WTO rules, we are often talking about the basic principles of the WTO, which are non-discrimination, no discrimination. We call it MFN, most favored nation principle. That means if you favor one country, you have to favor all. So it's no good, let's say, for example, the UK, I can't say the UK because currently the UK doesn't act on its own in the WTO because it's a part of the EU currently. What still is under the umbrella of the EU. It won't soon. It won't be in December. It'll be able to act on its own within the WTO. So a good example it would be India cannot favour Bangladesh over China. That would be an example. That would be reaching the most favoured nation principle. Or the other principle is national treatment, whereby somehow you protect your national goods over the imports. So you're maybe applying a VAT once the goods have come into the country. So that's another example of discrimination. And often the issue is about one particular member trying to protect their trade, and that's just natural, even though you are a member of the WTO, and although you want to abide by all the agreements, there is a natural instinct in all countries, it doesn't matter which country that you're a part of, there's a natural instinct to protect your national trade, and the idea is to try and create a balance. As I said, the appellate body has got 7 distinguished lawyers, 3 in a panel, independent from any government, and it normally reviews the law and legal interpretations of GATT or TRIPS. It isn't there to re-examine the evidence, and that's the same of any appeal court. Appeal courts don't have a re-trial, they simply look at whether the lower courts, or in this case the panel, have made the right decision on the facts and the regulations under the WTO. So the power of the appellate body, it can uphold, modify, reverse the panel's legal findings and conclusion. Often you will see when you look at WTO cases is that there's often a modification of the decision, but the outcome is still the same. So they might say that the application of GATT is incorrect, but nevertheless, the outcome is still the same. And again, once the appellate body has made a report, and it is binding once it's been created. Enforcement, the 30 days to report back from the DSB, how and when people will comply. It's normally a reasonable period of implementation, which is up to 15 months. And therefore, the losing side has to bring its policy, i.e. the policy that was infringing the principles of the WTO, has to bring it in line with the ruling and the recommendation. So if you have a particular rule that's infringed the no discrimination policy, then you have to amend the rule, and therefore going forward, there won't be that problem again. In case of non-compliance, compensation, there has to be benefits, tariff reductions, etc. Retaliation, putting the winning side back to the position it ought to have been in, if not in breach. So sometimes, for example, it may be the case that you experience dumping. Dumping is where a country is supplying goods for less than they are producing them for. Sometimes that's a difficult situation, particularly from goods coming from India and from China, where the costs are actually quite low. And so consequently, it can be sometimes difficult to find out whether it is really dumping or not. And there are particular rules about dumping. So that's the idea. So strengths and weaknesses, long time scale with no interim relief, no monetary compensation to the winner while the loser implements the decision. So for example, even if you, and this is what we're going to talk about strategy a little bit later on when we talk about Trump, is that the big players in the WTO can sometimes afford to break the rules because it's beneficial to them to break the rules. And as I always say, there's a good case to give an example of this. It's not a WTO case. It's a case I find interesting. It's the case of Microsoft. So the case of Microsoft was a case within the European Union. And Microsoft were putting software onto all of their hardware. So Microsoft had to be put onto every piece of hardware. And of course, in the European Union, which has very stringent rules about competition law, they were infringing competition law. Now, Microsoft knew that there would be a very, very high fine for breaching European law. But nevertheless, they continued to infringe that law. And they appealed the decision of the European Union when they lost the case. So in a nutshell, what Microsoft were doing was trying to tie down the European Union for 5 or 6 years in a lot of legal work, a lot of legal papers. And I think eventually they got a fine of £600 million. I think that's what they were fined eventually by the European Union. But actually, Microsoft knew already that they were going to be fined an excessive amount of money, but they calculated that it was worth being fined to keep that market share for the 6 years, because they knew that in the end, as a strategy, more people would know about Microsoft, etc., etc. So sometimes, like I say, if you're big enough, you can afford to delay the eventual fine because you're big enough to pay it. So there is a possibility in the WTO to suspend suspension if you don't comply. But of course, the WTO is there to try. Its purpose is to try and lift the economies of all countries, particularly the developing countries, trying to bring them up in some kind of equal platform if that's possible. It's not always possible. And I guess I said earlier about the principles of no discrimination. That doesn't always apply to developing countries. Developing countries are given special As if you're in a regional trading bloc, you're also given the rights to change your tariff levels there. So, for example, the European Union trades between itself with no tariffs at all, and people can move between the Union as well. So I can go right round the 28 members, and when I've come back home in a week's time, I won't have one stamp on my passport. And that's because we're all part of the European Union. Now, what I wanted to perhaps do, so that's kind of the background to the lecture, as you might say, but I wanted to just pick out one particular area which has been a little bit of an interest recently, given that everybody's supposed to apply and keep to the rules. The Trump administration is a very interesting strategy that Donald Trump has. Now, the reason why Donald Trump was elected to be president of the US was because he had come on a particular pledge. He had come on a particular manifesto, which he branded America was first. His strategy would be that whatever happens under his leadership, he would put America first. He would protect US jobs. So when he came to power, one of the first things that he did, he initiated a number of tariff changes to steel and aluminium, impacting mainly on China exports to the US, as well as some of the impact on the EU. So when Trump took over the president of the US, there was masses of China exports into the US. The US could not produce goods at the same expense as what it costs to make in the US, simply because it's like all developed countries. Once you become a developed country, you often have a problem with wages. Wages increase and it becomes more difficult to manufacture at a competitive level. Funny enough, I've got a motorbike, and I've just bought a new exhaust for that motorbike. And guess where I've got the exhaust from? China copper. Just gives an example. It's at 1/3 of the price of the Japanese price. Okay, so that decision to create tariff increase on steel and aluminium was in clear breach of GATT Article 3, national treatment. It was in a bid to protect the US's steel industry. Bearing in mind that the WTO promotes no discrimination. So that was one of his opening points, and he probably knew at that time. So the US did not agree it was protectionism. So they said no. And of course, the US have lots of lawyers, lots of people that are very inventive when it comes to the WTO, and think about how they can get around it. So they actually argued, saying, no, it's not protectionism that we're doing this for. It's got nothing to do with Donald Trump. They argued on the basis of an exception to GATT, which allows members to take action in particular circumstances. And for whatever reasons, and of course they had to invent something, they relied on an Article 21 GATT, which was a security exception, which suggested that products, that's steel and aluminium, could relate to B1, which was relating to the traffic in arms, ammunition, implements of war, and to such traffic in other goods and materials that's carried on directly or indirectly for the purpose of supplying a military establishment. Of course, that is complete and utter nonsense. But nevertheless, it is a defense. It is a defense. So that was the rationale why America, so it looked at GATT, looked at how it could defend itself, and then it ignored essentially the general principle of national treatment, no discrimination, and moved to use a particular section of the WTO. This exception was never fully explained, probably because it was a secret for security purposes and could not be fully disclosed. So you can imagine, whilst you use that as a defense, you can also say the reason why you know this information, but that's a secret. We can't let the panel or we can't let the WTO know the reasons for this. So, but the impact on the China steel export to the US dropped dramatically because it was a 25% tariff increase. Now you think of a 25% cost on an import, it's a massive difference, and it's the difference between somebody choosing China steel and US steel. So China lost billions of yen or billions of US dollars in revenue due to this tariff. So what did they do? Well, China, quite rightly, and under the WTO, responded in a countermeasure against US products. So it increased its tariffs on US goods. Now, one of the big imports from the US into China, chickens, but the difference was, and this is what Trump knew from the very start, that the loss to him was significantly lower than the loss to the US. So China had substantially more to lose than US. And I come back to we sometimes talk about rules and principles, but often what we're talking about is strategy. And that's what Donald Trump was using here. It was a strategy. So what was Trump trying to do? It wasn't just about protecting US jobs. He knew that he could only continue this idea, this strategy for a particular period of time. Yes, he wanted a reduction in exports from China to the US, but more than that, really what he wanted was to negotiate with China. So he wanted to get them round a table and tell them, listen, we take all these goods from you every year, and we're not getting the same benefit. So what you need to do is to do some deals with us. You need to spend more money in America. And that's one way of protecting jobs, by purchasing American goods. So Trump was not really concerned about the WTO. He was concerned about delivering his promise to the American people, and that was his strategy. So he knew that given the massive imports from China, he could renegotiate trade with them, and that's what really happened. It was never about really the WTO trade rules, and this is what we're talking about sometimes, that we might have a process, but sometimes countries are big enough and powerful enough that they can use their economic weight to change things without going through a legal process, as you might say. So it's big enough, and then you can, to a certain extent, you can, for a short period of time, ignore these rules. And there's little really the DSU can do when such countries make such decisions. And, that's the crux of, you might say, this discussion today, is really that's what can happen when you have a process and you can have big players there. And really, they know that what they're doing is infringing the general principles of the agreements, but nevertheless, it's worth it for them to do it because they have to try and resolve, you might say, the inequity of the import and export trade between each other. Okay, so that's my session today. I don't know if there are any questions. I'm happy to take any.
Yes, sir. There are a number of questions which are being asked by the students. So one by one, I am going to ask. So one of the question which our faculty, Dr. Yash Tiwari, has asked is the chat box itself. She asked that what could be way out to remove or reduce the imbalances between legislative and judicial bodies within organization. Further, how could the crisis related to composition of appellate body be tackled, especially during economy of most of the developing countries are hitting rock bottom?
Yeah, that's quite a long question, but I mean, essentially, you can't over legalize the WTO
Yes.
because it's not an organization that would work well with just legal rules. The WTO operates through communication, through negotiation, through that's how it works, because the real interpretation of those WTO rules comes in the ministerial conferences every few years. So you can't create some type of legal process which will make it more difficult for these individuals not to do something or to do something, because regardless of this WTO process, the DSU, you have to have a greater degree of, you might say, communication and consultation and negotiation. So there is a limit to what you can do in terms of changing the WTO rules. Any other questions?
Yes, sir. So one of the faculty has asked, there are lots of stories about countries imposing trade restrictions and export bans on medical products in reaction to COVID-19 virus outbreak. Are WTO members allowed to that?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? It broke up a little bit.
Sir, there are lots of stories about countries imposing trade restrictions and export bans on medical products in reaction to the COVID-19 virus outbreak. Are WTO members allowed to that?
Yeah, well, the thing about the COVID crisis is that, I mean, when you say medical, the medical exceptions, which there are medical exceptions for developing countries, and we saw that with HIV, whereby the drugs that came out for HIV were very, very expensive to start off with, but eventually the developing countries, particularly in Africa, were given license to make copies. Yeah, but the reality is that the medication has yet to be developed for COVID. There is no definitive. There's no definitive antibody for COVID-19 yet. We're just in the development process. Now, when that gets developed, when that drug gets developed, there will be a restriction, because the first thing the country does that develops it will be servicing their own country first and selling it to those people that are developed, that can pay for it. And then lastly, and it's always lastly, the developing countries will eventually get the license to produce it. But that will probably be down the line. But it may not be quite like that, simply because the nature of this pandemic, there might be an agreement whereby the remedy will be shared immediately, given that the death rate today has reached 1 million people.
Yes, sir. So moving ahead to the next question, what is the significance of WTO amid the trade wars between the US and China?
The significance of those trade wars is simply the significance of them are there to try to help the United States to renegotiate its trade agreements, simply because the United States has got economic problems. Even though it's an enormous country, it still has massive parts of it that are economically just deserts. So, for example, if you look at the car trade, you're looking at, if you went to places like Detroit 30 or 40 years ago, there'd be thousands and thousands of car workers. Now they're desolate. So there are large parts of it, the US industry, which have just evaporated. The one thing that, I mean, like all developed countries, their trade changes, and the American trade has changed from, you might say, manufacturing to high tech. So Microsoft and computing, and now you've got Tesla, you've got electric cars. They're looking for, energy costs. They're looking for, those new technologies. But that doesn't mean to say that the old industries don't have problems, because Donald Trump, one of his jobs was to he's still fracking gas, which has a massive impact on the environment, and they still got coal, they're still pulling coal out of the ground, so he still wants those votes from those areas which has suffered as a large result of the changes to manufacturing.
Yes, sir. So the most important question, which is being asked by one of the students, that Donald Trump has denounced WTO as worst trade deal ever made and has threatened to withdraw. What is your take on this?
Well, again, the Donald Trump has threatened to withdraw, and in fact, I think he may be in the process of withdrawing from the World Health Organization, the WHO, because he says that the management of the WHO has been dreadful, that i.e. COVID, because he's blaming China. He calls the COVID China disease. But this is just a strategy because he's in an election. Is currently in an election, and therefore these are just, you might say, strategic jobs that he's doing. This is just about a strategy to get re-elected. A lot of the things that he's saying probably won't come about, but it's all about appeasing his voters. Now, I don't think his voters are that bright, actually. So as long as you give enough headlines, I think that's what he's looking for. He's looking for a lot of nationalism. He's looking to not give money to elsewhere to keep it for the American people. So it's just a strategy to be re-elected.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. So still, the position is quite different nowadays, and we don't know what Trump is again taking, what steps he will be taking in future endeavors. So, on that context, WTO is often criticized as an instrument of operation in the hands of developed nations. So, please throw a light on this statement.
Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt, the WTO was established by developed countries. It wasn't established by developing countries. And the people that have the biggest say are those that really established it, which are the US. So you might say it's a bit, why do we deal in international currency with the dollar? Yeah. So why is, it's a little bit like that. And that's the nature of, might is right, or whether it's right or not, it just happens. Yeah. So those people in power will always have that influence, and this may change, because the thing about it is if you look at what's happening when you see developed countries, you're actually seeing quite a lot of deterioration with developed countries. So it is a problem with developed countries that have their own problems. There is very little growth in developed countries. So if you look at the growth rate of the European Union and the growth rate of the United States, it's minuscule. And if you compare that with China or a lot of Asian countries, which are developing, their GDP is developing every year, that gap is closing. Now, there are going to be countries, particularly China, and I've been there a few times, and I just simply open my mouth aghast at the developments in China. That in 50 years' time, it could be China that's the new power. It could change quite easily. But whilst that's why I think the European Union stays the European Union. The West is entrenched. But of course, it's that way. It's always been that way. All of the agreements that were developed after World War II were developed by the West. Whether you call it the UN, but it's not. They do have, I would say, greater influence. But overall, there is the impetus to try and benefit everybody. The WTO does have benefits for developing countries. There are safeguards that allow, for example, HIV drugs to be produced, or even drugs in India that we copied. they are copied on licenses that are approved. So it's not all bad, but yeah, it's slow, but there's no denying that the developed countries have probably the influence. That's always going to be the case.
Thank you, sir. One question. Why was the journey from GATT to WTO required? What inspired the formation of WTO?
I think it's probably two reasons. It's one I alluded to, which was the dispute settlement process was flawed under GATT. It wasn't effective at all. And then the other thing was, it was the economy itself. So you can imagine in 1945 when GATT was coming around, you looked at it was the destruction. Europe was destroyed. So you had to move around goods in order to build Europe. So that's why, it was established. It was established on that basis. But as we move forward, we see that the development of services or the movement of services is far greater now than it ever has been. So how many people went on holiday in 1945? How many people go on holiday now? So the service industry, and same with we talk about service, we talk about education. It's a massive service industry for both the US and the UK. It's education, and it's a service industry. So that's why you needed, you might say, a change from just goods to include services. And again, look what we look at when we look at software, intellectual property rights. I've been to some of them markets in India. They're not complying with the intellectual property rights, but it's because the world is changing that you needed the WTO.
Thank you, sir. So one of the question is, could the WTO be used to make the US back off tariffs?
No, it can't. It's eventually, if they continue down that road, there would be judgments against the US, but the US will make its decisions and then it will fight. So if the US had decided to continue with the steel tariffs for an indefinite period of time, it eventually would be a problem for the US. But what's the response for China? They can only retaliate with other tariffs. It isn't worth the while. If I'm selling India 500 billion pounds of goods every year, and India's selling me 3 billion, it hurts me more than it hurts you. So it's difficult to deal with the US or the big countries.
Thank you, sir. One more question. Are these institutional organizations such as WTO really a means to boost international trade, or just a fool in hands of developed economies to suppress developing and underdeveloped economies?
I think, to be honest, I think the WTO is a force for good, because there are countries that the later countries that have come to the WTO, such as Russia and China, realize that being outside the WTO is detrimental. So they've wanted to be a part of the game, as you might say. So I disagree. I think if it was no good, the WTO, then you'd have less members, and particularly institutions like China and Russia, who are perhaps a little bit more anti-developed Western. So they see the benefits of being part of the WTO, and I think for that reason, and probably on the basis that the world is a lot smaller, and countries, it's much easier to go to different countries and sell and trade and move goods around normally, a bit different now. That it's a force for good. Of course, it's not perfectly balanced, and it never will be. Where, as I've just said, the people with the highest might will always have the greatest influence. But that's the world. It will never change. That's just natural. It's natural. I can't hear you. I don't know if you're not.
It's not audible. I think ma'am.
So, sorry, extremely sorry. So, sorry, sir. How would you rate WTO's enforcement and dispute settlement mechanism? Do you find it effective in contemporary times?
I think it's doing very well. I think it's particularly now they've got lots of cases. So the more cases, the more cases that are developed, the more cases that are processed, then you get that body of precedents that are there, and the rules become better, to me, clearer once you get the judgments in. You know, the early cases, you know, you've got the gasoline case from the US that was DS2. You know, nobody really knew what was right or wrong. They're dealing with the agreements. But I think going forward, the greater the case law, greater the cases that have been decided will help people understand how to work within the WTO. It's not a perfect system, and it's the trouble with the WTO, dealing with such economic discrepancies between countries. You know, it's very, very difficult how to create an organization to treat everybody equally when everybody's not equal. Yeah? Everybody is, you know, there are complete different equalities between hundreds of the countries that are, 100 countries that are in there. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. One last question, sir. WTO is categorized as an undemocratic organization. What are your views regarding this?
Yeah, well, it's not a democracy, is it? It's by membership, and the memberships are countries. Some of them are democratic, some of them not. But it's not a one vote, one party system, if you get what I mean. So yeah, it's not designed. If it was a democratic situation, that would be a problem for the US, because they would only have one vote then. So they probably want to avoid that, you know. But it's not democratic, you know. And you've got, for example, the European Union that has 28 members within it. So, but they all operate under the same agreement. Whilst it might be not undemocratic, they can't just leave the rules and just do as they want. But as I said before and previously, you find that most of the cases are the European Union, the US, the big countries that are prepared to break the rules and fight for their goods, as you might say.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for such an enlightening session. And I think the basic concepts related to how WTO works and how the strategy or planning and other things were being done by Trump, you have thoroughly explained those. So with this, I just want to express my thanks to you on behalf of the Jagran Lakecity University School of Law. I'm extremely thankful to Dr. Steve Wood, who accepted our invitation to deliver lecture in this International Igniting Mind lecture series. Today, your talk on the WTO dispute system in the world of Trump was an eye-opener for all of us. And on behalf of university, I express my heartfelt gratitude to you for accepting this invitation and gracing your presence and address on this virtual platform. I'm also thankful to Honorable Chancellor Shri Harimohan Gupta, Honorable Pro-Chancellor Shri Abhishek Mohan Gupta, and Honorable Vice Chancellor Professor Dr. Anup Swarup for creating and nurturing the perfect ecosystem for us to organize such events. I am thankful to our Dean, Professor Yogen Kumar Srivastav, for being the guiding torch and leading us to thrive in our academic endeavor. I am thankful to my fellow program leaders and faculty members for their support. Special thanks to Mr. Abhishek Jain for enabling this lecture series during this period of pandemic. I acknowledge the support extended by Mr. Kuber Sir, ERP Administrator, who facilitates our online sessions in a great way. Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you to our beloved students, and I'm sure you have many takeaways from this lecture which will enrich your classroom discussions. With this, I end up this today's session, and we will be having an interaction with sir once again. So thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Goodbye. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
sir. Thanks a lot for joining with.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Thank you, Dr. Wood.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye, sir.
Bye.